The market revolution and territorial expansion were intimately connected with a third central element of American freedom, which is political democracy. The challenge to property qualifications for voting reached its culmination in the early 19th century. There was not one state that entered the Union after the original 13 states that required ownership of property to vote. And in a lot of the older states, they started to reconsider democracy's economic basis. By 1829, only North Carolina, Rhode Island, and Virginia were the only states that still had property requirements for voting. And really by 1860, there was only one state that still had property requirements for voting, and that was Rhode Island. And there they still required voters to own real estate that was valued at $130 or rent property that was at least $7 per year. And in Rhode Island, they had a lot of factories, and they had a steadily growing population of propertyless wage earners that were unable to vote. This stirred up a lot of discontent and ended up in like a little small rebellion that's known as the Dorr War, which really shouldn't be called a war because there was nothing warlike about it, and it lost a lot of steam. And Thomas Dorr, the Rhode Island lawyer that started it, ended up serving 2 years in prison for treason. But this little skirmish called the Dorr War demonstrated that the passions aroused by continuing to exclude any group of white men from voting would be creating problems. And the legislatures of Rhode Island soon eliminated the property qualification for native-born white men. The market revolution and political democracy produced a pretty large expansion of the public sphere, and there was also an explosion in printing that sometimes is called the information revolution. This really came about because the steam power that was central to the market revolution was applied to newspaper printing, and that created an increase in output and the rise of mass circulation, and newspapers called the penny press that were only 1 cent per issue instead of the traditional 6 cents per issue. There was also a new style of journalism that was really all about sensationalism, right? Like crime stories, exposés of official misconduct. And thanks to low postal rates, a lot of newspapers were able to circulate beyond where they were produced. Also, because there was an emergence of organized political parties that also spurred newspaper publication, each major party decided that they needed their own newspapers that supported their own views in every part of the country. Publications of all sorts of magazines and travel guides, advice manuals, religious titles, and other reading materials also rose dramatically. Because the cost of printing also was reduced, it made it possible for the appearance of like alternative newspapers in the late 1820s and 1830s. Things like the Freedom's Journal, the first black newspaper, the Philadelphia Mechanics Advocate or other labor publications, or the Abolitionist Weekly, The Liberator, or even a newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix, which was the first Native American newspaper. The vigorous public life of antebellum America was expansive and exclusive, and its limits were as essential to its nature as its broad scope. And while democracy in America was absorbing native-born poor white men as well as waves of immigrants, it was really putting up impenetrable barriers to the participation of women and non-white men, groups that were excluded from full participation in the market revolution as well. This principle of universal suffrage meant that white males of age constituted the political nation, right? And the debate over which people are or are not qualified to take part in American democracy really lasts well into the 20th century. The political world of the 20th century, so crucial to this exercise of American freedom, was defined in its contrast to the feminine sphere of the home. And if the exclusion of women from political freedom continued a long-standing practice, the increasing identification of democracy and whiteness marked a little bit of a departure. blacks were increasingly considered a group apart from whites. And this is noticed through racist imagery that became kind of popular theatrical presentations like minstrel shows where white actors dressed in blackface and entertained the audience by portraying African Americans as stupid and dishonest and altogether ridiculous. American authors either ignored blacks entirely in their writing or presented them as stereotypes, happy slaves that were long-suffering but devout Christians. This also coupled with an elaborate ideology of racial superiority and inferiority that was supplemented by scientific underpinnings. And these developments affected the boundaries of the political nation. As late as 1800, every state that had entered the Union, the single exception being Maine, limited the right to vote to white males. And states that had allowed blacks to vote previously had now taken away that privilege. And in 1821 in New York, the same constitutional convention that removed property qualifications for white voters raised the property requirements for blacks to $250, a sum beyond the reach of nearly all of the state's black residents. Despite these racial inequalities, a lot of whites of the Revolutionary generation had thought of African Americans as citizens of color, potential members of the body politic. But in the 19th century, the definition of the political nation became more and more associated with race. The federal government started to bar free blacks from service in state militias and the army. No state allowed free blacks full equality before the law. And in effect, race had replaced class as the boundary between those American men who were entitled to enjoy political freedom and those who were not. But this focus on race also helped solidify a sense of national identity among the diverse groups that were of European origin. In a country where the right to vote had become central to the meaning of freedom, it's really difficult to overstate the importance of the fact that white male immigrants could vote in some states almost from the moment they landed in America, while nearly all free blacks and, of course, slaves whose ancestors had lived in this country for centuries could not vote at all. The War of 1812 actually revealed how far the United States still was from being a truly integrated nation. With the Bank of the United States having its charter expired in 1811, we lacked a uniform currency and found it pretty much impossible to raise money for the war. We also still had a pretty primitive state of transportation, and our manufacturing faced really intense competition from low-cost imported goods, especially from Britain. And this led to the rise of a young generation of Republicans, with people at the helm by the names of Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, who would become very famous later on. And they really believed that the infant industries of manufacturing in the United States really deserved national protection. And this idea made it all the way to President Madison. And in his annual message, President James Madison put forward a blueprint for a government-promoted economic development that came to be known as the American System, which was a name that was given to it by Henry Clay. This plan rested on three main points, or three main pillars. There would be a new national bank, a tariff on imported manufactured goods to protect American industry, and federal financing of improved roads and canals. Congress actually enacted the Internal Improvements Program drafted by Calhoun, only to be completely blown away when the president, who had spoken about the American system, decided to veto that bill. Madison, over time, had become convinced that allowing the national government to exercise powers not mentioned in the Constitution would be very dangerous, and he really thought that a constitutional amendment would be necessary for the federal government to build roads and canals. The other two parts of this plan did, though, become law. The tariff offered protection to goods that could be produced in the United States, especially cheap cotton textiles. And a lot of Southerners supported this tariff, believing that it would help the South develop a manufacturing base like New England's. And in 1816, a new Bank of the United States was created with a 20-year charter from Congress. The Second Bank of the United States soon became the focus of a lot of public resentment. It was a private, profit-making corporation that served as the government's financial agent. It issued paper money, it collected taxes, and it paid the government's debt. It was also in charge of ensuring that the paper money issued by local banks had real value. The bank was also in charge of promoting economic growth by helping to finance manufacturing and commerce by extending loans. They also printed paper money. Paper money at this time consisted of notes that promised to pay the bearer on demand a specific amount of specie, which would be gold or silver. So the value of the currency that was issued by individual banks really depended on that bank's reputation for stability. Since banks often printed far more money than they had specie in their vaults, the value of paper currency fluctuated wildly. The Bank of the United States was supposed to prevent the overissuance of money. And the Bank of the United States could demand payment in gold and silver from a local bank in exchange for that bank's paper money. This was supposed to prevent local banks from acting improperly, because if it couldn't provide the specie when the Bank of the United States asked, it would have to suspend their operations or close. But instead of effectively regulating the currency and loans issued by local banks, the Bank of the United States participated in speculation that swept the country after the War of 1812. This was due to the huge overseas market for American cotton and grain, demands to purchase land that was especially acute in the South. And as early as 1819, as European demand for American farm products returned to normal levels, this economic bubble of speculation burst. The demand for land plummeted, and speculators who had invested lost millions of dollars as the price of Western lands fell. The Bank of the United States, followed by state banks, started asking for payments from the people who had loaned money. Farmers and businessmen could not repay, and they declared bankruptcy, and unemployment rose in eastern cities. This became known as the Panic of 18, and it lasted a little more than a year, but it really disrupted the political harmony of previous years. The panic deepened many Americans' distrust of banks, and it undermined the reputation of the Second Bank of the United States because most people blamed the bank for causing the panic. Several states retaliated against the National Bank by taxing its local branches, and these tax laws ended up going to the Supreme Court in a case called McCulloch v. Maryland, which was argued in 1819. And in this court case, Chief Justice John Marshall declared that the bank was a legitimate exercise of congressional authority under the Constitution's clause that allowed the Congress to pass necessary and proper laws. Therefore, the states lacked the authority to destroy an agency that was created by a national government. In 1816, James Monroe had defeated the last federal candidate, Rufus King, to become the last of the Virginia presidents. When he was up for re-election in 1820, the Federalists really were unable to field many electoral tickets, and Monroe was able to carry the entire country. Monroe's 2 terms in office were years of one-party government, sometimes called the era of good feelings. Plenty of bad feelings were around, and in the absence of two-party competition, politics often organized themselves along lines of competing sectional interests. And this really was exemplified in the Missouri controversy, because in 1819, Congress considered a request from Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state. A Republican congressman decided that he wanted them to allow them to be introduced, but with having no more slaves entered, and children who were already slaves there would be freed at the age of 25. This sparked a lot of controversy, and Republican unity shattered along sectional lines. Eventually, a senator from Illinois by the name of Jesse Thomas proposed a compromise that had 3 parts. Missouri would be authorized to draft a constitution without the slavery restriction. Maine, which prohibited slavery, would be admitted to the Union to maintain the sectional balance between free and slave states in the Senate, and slavery would be prohibited in all remaining territory within the Louisiana Purchase north of the 3630 line, which was Missouri's southern boundary. This became known as the Missouri Compromise. And this controversy raised for the first time what would end up being a pretty fatal issue for the United States, the westward expansion of slavery. This was the first sectional division that revealed these widespread feelings of disunity within the nation. For the moment, the slavery issue faded after the Missouri Compromise from national debate, but it would come back in the future. Between 1810 and 1822, Spain's Latin American colonies rose in rebellion and established a series of independent nations, including Mexico, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru. These uprisings inspired a wave of sympathy from the United States. And in 1822, James Monroe became the first government to extend diplomatic recognition to the new Latin American republics. Parallels existed between the Spanish-American revolutions and the one that had given birth to the United States. Both were brought on by programs launched by the imperial country, really aimed at making the colonies contribute more to its finances. And just like in the United States, the colonists of Latin America had become used to kind of ruling themselves. But unlike the British Empire, Spain's empire dissolved into 17 different countries instead of just one large country. The Spanish Empire was much too vast and disconnected for a common sense of nationhood to emerge. And in some ways, the new Latin American constitutions were more democratic than that of the United States. Many created a single national people out of the diverse populations that made up the Spanish Empire, and often extended the right to vote to Indians and free blacks. Most also called for the gradual abolition of slavery. But the Latin American wars of independence usually lasted quite a bit longer, sometimes more than a decade, and were much more destructive than the one in the United States. And often in these countries, independence was followed by civil war. At the time of these revolutions, James Monroe's Secretary of State was John Quincy Adams, and he was really worried that Spain was going to try to regain its Latin American colonies. So in 1823, he drafted a section of the president's annual message to Congress that became known as the Monroe Doctrine. And it had three major principles. First, the United States would oppose any further efforts at colonization by European powers in the Americas. Second, the United States would abstain from involvement in the wars of Europe. And finally, Monroe warned European powers not to interfere with the newly independent states of Latin America. For many decades, this document became the cornerstone of American foreign policy, and it claimed for the United States the role of the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. This document, the Monroe Doctrine, reflected a rising sense of American nationalism. But sectionalism seemed to rule domestic politics, and the election of 1824 really exemplified that. The only candidate that could claim truly national support was Andrew Jackson, and his policy didn't rest on any kind of specific public policy. His popularity rested on his military victories over the British at the Battle of New Orleans and over the Creek and Seminole Indians in Florida. Other candidates in the race were John Quincy Adams, Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford of Georgia, and Henry Clay from Kentucky. John Quincy Adams' support was mainly concentrated in New England and really generally in the North, where Republican leaders insisted that the time had come for the South to relinquish the presidency. Crawford represented the South's old Republicans who wanted the party to reaffirm the principles of states' rights and limited government, and Clay was one of the era's most popular politicians, but his support in 1824 was really only in the West. In the outcome of the election, Jackson received only a little over 150,000 votes and carried states in all the regions outside New England. But because there were 4 candidates in the field, not one of them received a majority of the electoral votes. And when that happens, according to the Constitution, the Clay, who finished 4th place, was eliminated, and the choice among the other 3 fell to the House of Representatives. Now, Clay was the Speaker of the House at the time and believed that Adams was going to be the most qualified candidate and the one that most was likely to support his program of the American system, and likely believed that Jackson, a Westerner, would impede his own presidential ambitions, so Clay threw his support behind John Quincy Adams, and that helped to elect him. Soon after Adams became president, Henry Clay became the Secretary of State in Adams' cabinet. This led many to believe that Clay had made a corrupt bargain, that he had bartered critical votes in the presidential Congress for a public office for himself, and this clung to Clay for the rest of his career and made it pretty much impossible for him to ever think that he could become president. The election of 1824 really laid the groundwork for a new system of political parties. Supporters of Jackson and Crawford would soon unite into a new organization, the Democratic Party, and the alliance of Clay and Adams became the basis for the Whig Party of the 1830s. John Quincy Adams actually had one of the most distinguished pre-presidential careers of any American president, but he was not an engaging figure. But he had a clear vision of national greatness. He strongly supported the American system, and he really wanted to encourage American commerce throughout the world. This was actually shown in that Adams negotiated a treaty where the United States acquired Florida from Spain, and he also created an agreement with Great Britain that fixed the Canadian-American border at the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. Adams held this view, though, that the federal power was far more expansive than most of his contemporaries. At a time when many Americans felt that governmental authority posed the greatest threat to freedom, Adams really shocked a lot of people when he made statements like, "Liberty is power." He believed the United States, the freest nation on earth, would also become the mightiest. His administration also spent more on internal improvements than his 5 predecessors combined, and it enacted a steep increase in tariffs in 1828. But Adams' programs handed his political rivals a really powerful weapon. By using individual liberty, states' rights, and limited government as their rallying cries, Andrew Jackson's supporters began to organize for the election of 1828 almost as soon as John Quincy Adams took office in 1825. And Martin Van Buren, who was a senator from New York, really oversaw this and was the architect of this new Democratic Party. Van Buren himself represented this new political era. He was the son of a tavern keeper. He was a talented party manager and a person of not a person of great vision or intellect. But Van Buren had a really compelling idea about political parties. Rather than being dangerous and divisive, as the founding generation had thought, he thought that political parties were necessary and a desirable element of political life. He thought that political parties would provide a check on those that were in power, and it would offer voters a real choice in elections. He also thought that national parties could counteract the sectionalism that really had become very obvious in the 1820s. He also thought that it would form a bond of unity in a divided nation. By 1828, Van Buren had established the political apparatus of the Democratic Party, complete with local and state party units overseen by a national committee and a network of local newspapers that were devoted to the party. Adams, though, refused to dismiss federal office holders who campaigned for Jackson and really did very little to promote his own re-election. Jackson's supporters made very few campaign promises and really relied on their candidate's popularity and the workings of the party machinery to get out the vote. The election of 1828 was filled with mudslinging. Jackson's supporters accused Adams of having had a series of mistresses while serving as a diplomat in Europe. They also praised their candidate's frontier manliness and ridiculed Adams' intellectual attainments, with a campaign slogan like, "Vote for Andrew Jackson who can fight, not John Quincy Adams who can write." Jackson's opponents condemned him as a murderer for having executed army deserters and killing men in duels. And they questioned the morality of his wife, Rachel, because she had married Jackson before her divorce from her first husband had become final. Jackson always believed that his opponent's slander had contributed to his wife's death shortly after the election. By 1828, voters, not the legislature, were choosing presidential electors in every state except South Carolina. This encouraged this vigorous campaigning style and high voter turnout. In 1828, Jackson won a resounding victory with 650,000 votes to 500,000 for Adams. He carried the entire South and West along with Pennsylvania. Jackson's election was the first to demonstrate how the advent of universal male white voting, organized by national political parties, had transformed American politics. For better or for worse, the United States had entered the age of Jackson.